This is Celtic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
So we thought it'd be funny to call it Broderbund and put a slash through the L. Caused all kinds of grief. There was a competition between us and a number of other companies like Sierra Online and Sirius software to see how many we could get on the bestseller list at the same time. And I think maybe the best we ever did was something like 6 products out of 30. It was kind of a game. We had very talented engineers in-house who loved to try to put copy protection on, and sometimes carried it to unfortunate lengths. I drove across the country and back over 5 weeks and sold about $15,000 worth of software, and often ended up staying at the homes of the people who owned the little computer stores. I would just look up a name of a computer store in every town I went through and zigzag across the country.
I'm Kevin Savitz, and this is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. Doug Carlston was co-founder and CEO of the software publisher Broderbund. Broderbund published many hits across several platforms, including Bank Street Writer, The Print Shop, AE, Choplifter, Lode Runner, Karateka, Spelunker, David's Midnight Magic, and Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? This interview occurred March 5th, 2015. Tell me about how Broderbund got started, please.
Broderbund got started in part because I had been an attorney in Maine. I had bought a Tandy TRS-80 program to do the boring stuff in the law office. I'd been a programmer since the early 60s, so I'd paid for college in part by programming at the computer center for other people and so on. I was visiting a brother up in Eugene, Oregon, who was tired of his job setting up marchathons for walkathons for March of Dimes, and I said, I've written a bunch of games. They're actually being published by other people in non-exclusive contracts. Why don't you try selling them? And if that works, I'll make some more. So we named the company Broderbund, in no particular language, and started doing that. We went to something called the West Coast Computer Fair 2 weeks later down in San Francisco. Met a gentleman from Japan who had a series of Apple II games that he was looking for distribution for. We ended up picking that up, and then the combination gave us, I think, a total of 5 or 6 games, and that really was when Broderbund took off. About 6 months after we started, suddenly we had thousands of dollars a month in revenue, and we grew very quickly after that. And in fact, that Christmas we had one product in particular that came from Japan that sold over $100,000 worth, and suddenly we could pay our bills and so forth.
What product was that?
It was called Apple Galaxian. It was a rip of a coin-op game, which we didn't realize because we hadn't seen the game here. And eventually we changed the name to Alien Rain, but we also eventually negotiated with Atari, who owned the rights, and discontinued those games in a friendly way. We were, however, essentially an Apple II house at that point. TRS-80 proved to be a very difficult market to sell to because Tandy didn't want independent stores moving product, and so we stopped selling those.
Because if you wanted to sell TRS-80 stuff, it was basically you needed to sell at Radio Shack, and if you didn't have that in...
That's right, and it didn't make any sense, and they weren't really very interested in third-party software, so that was a very tough sell. But we had our eye on both Commodore and Atari, and I think in 82 or so, fairly early on, since we weren't getting a lot of people submitting Atari or Commodore product to us because we were known as an Apple II house, we made our first acquisition, a company called Synapses, which had been started by Ihor Wolosenko and I think Ken Grant. I mean, it was just Ihor and Ken worked for him. I don't recall. And so that was how we tried to expand our offerings. Although there wasn't a whole lot of synergy initially, the games that we had on the Atari and the games on the Apple were quite different. So moving them together was a slow process. So that's basically how Broderbund got started. Mostly games, but not entirely.
What's with the slash through the O in Broderbund?
Oh well, my brother was a Scandinavian studies major in college, and our name is Swedish. The Danish umlaut is a slash through the O, but it's also the computer zero. So we thought it'd be funny to call it Broderbund and put a slash through the O.
All right.
Caused all kinds of grief.
Just through legal papers and that sort of thing.
Nobody knew how to pronounce it, and nobody knew quite how to spell it, and most typewriters didn't have a slash zero. So what are they supposed to do at that point? So most people ignored it. Some people who were a little more European-centric knew that the other way to do an umlaut is to put an E after the vowel, so then it would be B-R-O-E.
Mm-hmm.
And we called it Broderbund, but a lot of people just called it Broderbund, and we never cared, actually.
All right. So the thing with synapses, I understand, didn't work out too well. I mean, eventually those games didn't sell, and
the games didn't sell enormously well, but I think the main issue was that we didn't have any experience in merging two companies. The cultures were quite different. They were much more laid back than we were, than I was, to be honest. And so a lot of people just left. I think Tammy Chance was the only person that stayed any length of time. And they had some good people. But without the core group of people, it wasn't going to work long term. And so I think I'd put that down as one of our least successful acquisitions. And I don't think it really was the quality of the product. I think it was our own inexperience at how you did that sort of thing.
So I'm sorry, what did you say that your first big hit from Japan was? The Apple Galaxian?
Apple Galaxian was the first game hit, yeah.
And what was your next big one after that? I'm looking at the list here, trying to figure out what was next. Choplifter or
oh no,
Print Shop. No, Print Shop came later. So.
Well, the truth is that a lot of our revenue in the first couple of years came from a line of accounting packages with exciting names like Payroll, General Ledger. Probably never made the bestseller list, but they were selling for $500 each, so they sold quite well. And then I think our next big hit was probably Bank Street Writer, a word processing program that I think came out in '82. I don't have the list in front of me, and my memory's a little foggy. Mm-hmm. But Snoggle was somewhere in there. That was certainly before Choplifter. I think Alien Ran was first. The Doug Smith game, Lode Runner, I think came out a little before Choplifter, but those are 83, 84. 84 was also Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego and Print Shop, which were big long-term hits. David's Midnight Magic, I think, came out somewhere in that early area and went up the list. There was a competition between us and a number of other companies like Sierra Online and Sirius Software to see how many we could get on the bestseller list at the same time. And I think maybe the best we ever did was something like 6 products out of 30 showing up. The problem was the magazines typically were format specific. Right. And so you would have, and since the games in particular would do well in very differing formats, it was a long time before there was a real consolidation of the list. And the migration of platforms was expensive and hard to deal with. It cost a lot of money to port things to all the different formats unless you were sure that each one was going to sell well. And most of your outside programmers didn't have a broad range of programming skills. They could do one machine typically, and they were loyal to their machine. And so you had to make the bet as a publisher whether it was worth moving everything over. And a few products got to that level, but I don't even know if our most successful products all made it to the Atari 800. Very few went to the Atari 400. It's like the Commodore VIC. We had a few things in that cartridge format, but you were always trying to see what the next thing the hardware companies were going to move to was. They typically were not backward compatible. And then the video game machines were starting to come in, the VHS from Atari and so on, and those really clouded the market because they had such limited capability. You couldn't just take the same game over. You had to really code them from the start for that market. And I think Atari VHS was the first cartridge-based video games that we put a lot of effort into and had a number. And I think we may have OEM'd those to Atari. I'm trying to remember. Again, I'm getting a little foggy on it, but I do remember they were difficult to do, and you were sort of locked into a relatively high cartridge price. So it wasn't as economically attractive as the floppy disk market at the time.
Sure.
That obviously changed over time. So
did you, if you have an idea for a product, how would you make a decision? Okay, this is something that's going to sell to the Atari market, or Atari users probably don't want this sort of thing. Did you get an intuition for that, or
we were principally a publisher of externally produced product. Most of our internal programmers were doing ports of things from one area to another. So you started with a product in one format or another, and you saw how it sold. And if it sold at a certain level, then you tried to port it over. You didn't typically make that decision up front. We ported things and the problem with games is they often don't have a very long shelf life. So this is a risky bet because you're saying, well, it may be gone in one format by the time you move it to something else. So unless there was a real appetite by the part of the development group to do multiple formats, which was increasingly true over time, that was very hard to do. The part of the problem with both the Commodore and the Atari markets was that the hardware companies themselves were interested in moving from 8-bit to 16-bit platforms in a non-compatible way. So things like the Amiga, or what was the Atari equivalent to the Amiga, they had a
Atari ST.
The ST, right. Got a lot of the excitement inside that community, and yet that was still a smaller market. So we tended to stick with our strengths. We did switch to PC when it came along just because the installed base looked to be huge. It was not initially in the games area a very attractive market because it was principally a business environment machine, but we were always productivity in part, and so we paid attention to it, and we also found it easier to find programmers to do that as well as whatever their base platform was, because they all were betting on what they thought was the future. Then the Apple II market did the same thing that Atari and Commodore did. It was being replaced in Steve Jobs' mind by the Macintosh, which was not only totally incompatible, but had a totally different set of operational constraints. As I recall, it was initially only black and white, so all this work in gaming didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, and so on. So staying alive with all these platform switches going on in the early 80s was a real challenge, and it probably meant we did fewer ports than we might have done otherwise. We ported the most successful things, and we didn't port other things, just for economic reasons.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Let's talk about piracy. Mm-hmm. How big of a concern was it? I was just reading some old articles online, and there was one article in Antic that said at one point a lot of the third-party publishers for Atari had gotten out of the market because of piracy, but Broderbund was soldiering on, and it seems like you got I don't know. Just talk to me about your feelings about piracy and how you dealt with it.
Well, there are multiple points of view on this. My personal point of view was that piracy probably had less impact than most people thought on what your actual revenues were going to be, because a lot of people who pirated software were not necessarily going to buy it anyway. But it was kind of a game. We had very talented engineers in-house who loved to try to put copy protection on, and sometimes carried it to unfortunate lengths. I remember that with the Atari specifically, there was a way in which you could cause there was a EEPROM you could burn and put into a disk drive that would allow you to copy things that you couldn't copy otherwise. And we could detect it, and one of the programmers thought it would be fun to, when he detected that, to recalibrate the disk drive back and forth, which can break a disk drive very quickly. It breaks the worm screw in it while playing a little da-da-da-da-da kind of tune over it. This was Glenn Axworthy, Christopher. And of course, the first thing that happened, the way I found out about this, was actually an indignant call from a reviewer who had perfectly legitimate reasons for having the EEPROM in his drive, and of course had his drive destroyed by our software. So we got it out of there as quickly as we could. But there was a constant battle between what I'd call more legitimate copy protection techniques than that, and the engineers who lived just to bust it. But people would come in and say, I've got a way that we write to the keyboard buffer, and if they start trying to break the code, they'll be erasing the very code they're trying to break. All kinds of crazy things like that. I really do think that it was, and I was involved with this a lot because I was the first president of the Software Publishers Association and did that or chairman for 10 years. And it was very involved with trying to stop piracy in various sorts. And my private point of view was that it was making a bigger deal than it was, that it was actually a form of marketing. It increased your visibility. People didn't really pirate stuff they weren't interested in having, and so it tended to get it out there. And when CDs came along, for a while, piracy just went away. I don't know if people remember, there was a long time when people couldn't copy CDs, period. So suddenly you got a real sense of what the zero piracy market actually looked like. And that gave you a sense of how much you had lost in the past. And we got a nice bump by that, but it wasn't like suddenly doubling or tripling the rate of growth that we'd had before. So I think the truth is what I thought. The piracy actually had less impact on your actual revenues than you thought, and it probably gave you a lot of visibility that you might not have had otherwise.
So did software authors generally approach you and say, "Hey, I've developed this thing. Do you want to see it?" Or did you contract out for things?
We advertised heavily for software authors with their ideas because committees make lousy products generally, and trying to say, this is what we want, please make this, seemed like a really bad idea. We did try it in-house. I think we had one notable success, which was the Carmen Sandiego educational games. Mm-hmm. And honestly, virtually all our other well-known products came over the transom as a result of our solicitations. We ran ads in magazines for years soliciting authors to send us things, and we had a big review process that we went through that was typically me, my brother, a couple other people looking at product and trying to see if we thought potential was there. They were usually 70 or 80% done at the time we saw them. And if you saw a germ of a good product, then you would work with them. And some of them were big changes. For example, when we first saw what became Print Shop, it had no print function. It only was a screen display product. It would make a cute little greeting card and throw it up on the screen. And printers were just starting to go into homes. This was in '83, and I thought it would be a perfect OEM opportunity. We could go to every printer manufacturer and say, you won't sell into homes unless you have some reason to justify it beyond the fact that you can make really bad-looking typewritten letters, and so we did that. But I think that in general, you tried to find what would make the most sense for a particular product to help it succeed in the market. Things would come in with no sound, with no audio. We'd add audio. Things would come in where the gameplay was great, but the visuals were obviously made by somebody who had no artistic ability whatsoever. So you would add that, and so on.
Can you remember any notable submissions that were just so terrible or just so inappropriate or just like, that you had to laugh? And
well, yes, I don't want to particularly cast stones, but there are some people who succeeded greatly afterwards that I think probably would not take it amiss. Jordan Mechner did the Prince of Persia series, as well as several of the Karateka and the Last Express. Mm-hmm. And his first submission to us while he was still in college was something called Death Bounce, in which colored balls bounced around on the screen and tried to kill you, squash you, and you tried to shoot them out of the air. And I remember, because Jordan kept a copy of it, writing him about a 9-page letter explaining why this wasn't a really good game, because there was no character development, there was no storyline, there was none of this. It resonated with him because he always wanted to be a film producer, not a game maker. And he came back with Karateka a year and a half later. Mm-hmm. So, and he still remembers Death Bounce. He thinks I was a little harsh on it, but he said it actually motivated him to do something he was more interested in, which was to build storyline. There was one other example that is fresh in my mind. I was up in Seattle earlier this week at a friend's house, a guy named Neil Stevenson, a science fiction writer, mm-hmm. and he's now director of creative development for a new company called Magic Leap, which is a VR, AR kind of company. And the director of creative at Magic Leap came up to me when we were up there and said, "You may not remember me, but you may remember my product because I introduced it to Broderbund and you rejected it." and then I won't say the name of the product or the guy, but I was kind of embarrassed. He said, "Oh no, it was probably good for me. My life has done very well since then." So, thank you.
Nice.
So, anyway, it does happen.
What are you particularly proud of a product or an idea that you guys released?
You know, there was a piece that Stuart Alsap wrote about the company back in the late 80s, saying what he most admired about Broderbund is that they often did non-derivative work that opened up new genres, new areas. And that was across formats. So I think he was talking specifically about print shop being a whole new way of using a computer, something called For Comment, which is now built into Microsoft Word as track changes, but we did it back in the era of LANs and allowed groups of people to work on a single written document together. So a lot of it was productivity. Memory Mate was another. I mentioned, a flat file database. But it was also true in games that often they were not only not derivative, but they kind of broke new ground, and something like Myst was an example of that. I was certainly proud of that. I also was very fond of 3D Home Architect, the first sort of intelligent a home design product that would keep you within the lines. It was like drawing within lines. It would only let you draw things that were to code, and it would help you. It would do a plan check and tell you where you were getting off the reservation and stuff like that. And I thought Family Tree Maker, the genealogy program, genealogy is not a hobby of mine, but I have an aunt who's very keen on it, and she gave me feedback and said, it was at the time something that made her very proud to be associated with the company as a shareholder, because she had seen so many terribly bollocks efforts. Generally, people in the consumer business, and I'd say not just Broderbund, but many of the companies that you've interviewed with, had I think a keener sense of consumer interface and user interface design than the wide world does. And I'd include automobile manufacturers, appliance manufacturers in there, as well as business software companies. But I do think that it's something that we bring to the table. And every time I see something like Google Earth, for example, I look at it and I say, I know game guys built that. In fact, I got to know them, and they were game guys. And that user interface was designed straight out of some games that they had done before. And there's a lot of cases like that where you see really good design, you probably have a gamer somewhere behind it.
Nice. This apropos of nothing. My business, I publish websites, and my company has about 100 websites, and most of them offer printable documents and templates. I have a site that offers coloring pages, and one that offers greeting cards, and one that offers signs. And I was running this business for several years before I realized, I just reinvented Print Shop. That's all I did.
Well, good for you. That's great.
Any projects or ideas for products that you wanted to do that you couldn't do, that didn't pan out, that you had to let by the wayside for one reason or the other?
Well, sometimes there were timing issues. We just didn't get to them in time. For a long time, I'd wanted to build a tool that would allow people to take photographs and archive them and store them and sort them and so forth. And the problem was that back then digital photography was still a minority, and getting everybody to scan their photographs in was just too much of a gating item. But I figured digital was coming soon, and we did actually do one. We got our first cut in right before Broderbund got sold. And I liked the idea, and of course it's now built into the universe that we live in. Right. But it did seem to me that it was a perfect consumer product. It was something that people needed to organize, that was hard to organize, that you could then go directly from that to making books, calendars, cards. Sounds kind of print shoppy, right? So you could do that with all that material. We also had bought tea makers, so we were already in the click art business, and so going into digital photography seemed like a logical extension to me. And the first cut of the product was really good, and it was so much better than the first iPhoto that came out. But by then Broderbund was being acquired, so it never went anywhere. In fact, I think the code base disappeared, as often happens with a reasonably hostile takeover, which is what it was.
So yeah, let's talk about that. Why did Broderbund sell, or why was it taken over? How did the ending come?
Well, the company had been publicly traded for 8 years or so. We had spread shares essentially to every employee, and the family control, we were down to, 9% or something. We had a very small minority of it. And as you get larger, it's harder to keep getting 15% annual growth. A series of my senior managers had retired. It's hard work, and they were tired, and they'd been working hard for 15 years or so, and we ended up, I think, in a situation where there was an aggressive roll-up of the industry by a company called SoftKey at the time, and they had bought a competitor that was making a direct competitor to a couple of our products, including Print Shop, and we're selling them for $29.95 with a $30 rebate. So, which I'm sure was a gimmick, but it devastated those products in the market. And we had a couple of big products that were slow to get to market, didn't roll out in time, and we went from being very, very profitable. I think we went from an $80 million profit one year to a $5 million loss the next, and it was partly sort of these things. The market reacted with some panic, and our stock price dropped to a point where over 50% of our acquisition price, what it would have taken to take the company over, you could pay for with the cash we had in the bank, because we had hundreds of millions of accumulated profits in the bank, and I never believed in dividending it out because I figured there would always be a rainy day when we would need it. It didn't occur to me that people could acquire us and then use our own cash to pay for the acquisition, which was partly what happened. So it was naivete on my part. I didn't see it coming and didn't know how to do poison pills and those kinds of corporate things. That's not part of my universe. So that's basically what happened. It's too bad. We had 1,500 people who lost their jobs over the next 2 years as the people who acquired us flipped us and then broke us up and did all the things that, people are driven mostly by short-term profit generally do to companies. Yeah. To be fair, this was the late 90s. The internet was changing things pretty fundamentally in the industry, and I'm not sure that the packaged goods software industry was going to be anything like what it had been up to that point. There was a gift economy emerging that the internet made possible. There was also kind of a shareware, freeware market that was putting a lot of downward pressure on pricing. The idea of people spending $60 for and up for consumer applications was quickly going away, with the one niche exception, which was sort of the console video game high-end market, and that went the other way in part because those games were getting phenomenally more expensive to build. I think Myst cost $300,000. The sequel, Riven, was $10 million. EA did something the next year that cost $30 million, and I understand nowadays it can be $100 million and up for the major console games. So that was just changing the fundamental nature of the business.
So when you got started, it was a guy in his bedroom coding on his VIC-20, right?
By himself.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a one-man shop. So, it was the artist as hero. That was the old EA line, I remember, where they were going to make them all stars. And, of course, what actually happened was they all became teams. They became groups of people because no one person could put those things together anymore.
You made me think of another question. At the very beginning, before you were Broderbund, but you were just this little company, was it difficult getting into the computer stores when you were nobody and you're just like, oh yeah, we have this Galactic Empire, or we have Apple Panic or whatever?
It was actually easier.
Really?
And the reason it was is if you put yourself back in the early 80s, the computer stores were pretty much run by geeks rather than businessmen. In fact, they spent most of their time in the back room playing with the hardware and trying to avoid the customers. The first and only sales trip I did, which was in 1980, I drove across the country and back over 5 weeks and sold about $15,000 worth of software, and often ended up staying at the homes of the people who owned the little computer stores. I would just look up a name of a computer store in every town I went through and zigzag across the country. Walk in, there'd be typically nobody in the store. I'd go to each machine and I'd load something on each machine. There'd be some noise starting to come out of the machines, and somebody would come running from the back room to see who was stealing their stuff, and for the first time see their computers actually doing something, instead of the little carrot that used to be on the screen. Mm-hmm. So it was so early. I mean, 2 years later, that wouldn't have been the case, but it was so early that, in fact, it was pretty easy to just, get into hacker talk with these guys, and they would buy on the spot, COD. So I would just call my brother, and he'd make them and stick them in the mail, and, they were cassettes at first. They weren't even floppy disks, and they would send them off the same day. So that was a window where naivete and lack of expertise didn't hurt us. Also, I'm the world's worst salesperson. I hated sales. I didn't ever want to make somebody buy something they didn't want to buy already. The fact that the games that we started with included a bunch of games I had written and had published by other people meant they were typically already familiar with them. So when I said, well, I'm actually the author and I'm selling, they were happy to go straight to the source. So that's how we got a lot of the initial sales. And then, of course, they saw stuff running on their machines in their office, so they knew what they'd be buying. They'd say, I want that thing over there that's playing Hyper Head-On or Golden Mountain or whatever it was. So that made it easier.
What haven't I asked you that I should have?
Well, I haven't given you very much on Atari, and I apologize. It was not a major thrust of our company. And I think probably anything I once could have told you about the Jack Tramiel battles and so forth is long lost in my foggy memory. No, I hope that I'm glad that you're archiving this. I hope that people have some level of interest in sort of the early days of this stuff. It was a very exciting time, and an enormous number of people who otherwise would not have been involved in business in any form, got into it because of their love of this new medium coming out. And we were a little luckier than most, and we lasted longer than most. But I think there are hundreds of people that I got to know along the way that dropped off at one point or another, but still remembers the most exciting point of their youth or their business careers. So thank you for your interest in it, and I hope that people who do hear this enjoy it as much as I enjoyed experiencing it.
I think they will. Thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.